3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about Phase 18, the Cold War. So going back about 75 years ago, the world had just survived back-to-back world wars that brought horrific destruction across the world. And now, the world had entered another conflict. This one, though, was different, because so much of it was just about ideology and these competing ideas. Capitalism and communism, which were fighting each other for influence in the world. And this also brought the threat of a new type of warfare called nuclear war. So this is a story of the war that could have been even more disastrous than World War I and World War II combined. So this ideological war was between two superpowers: the United States of America, a democracy, and the Soviet Union, a dictatorship which was a federation of nations made up of the following countries: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. However, before we discuss the war, we must first understand the origins of the ideologies that were competing in this era. As mentioned earlier, first you have capitalism, the economic system of the United States of America, and second, you had a form of socialism called communism, which is the economic system of the Soviet Union. So first, when talking about socialism, which I think for many people is a little bit more confusing, socialism was an economic concept which is based on the idea that the public should have ownership of property and natural resources instead of private ownership. Thus, the nation as a whole owns the industries which produce goods in society instead of private companies. And the idea behind this concept is that everyone should share the profits of production since they are part of the production process of goods. Therefore, everyone should share ownership of these things produced by a nation to prevent greed and allow for goods and services to be spread equally amongst the nation's population as needed. So the whole concept, in theory, is that you're going to have greater equality and a greater sharing of goods. Under capitalism, however, production is privately owned and wages and prices are based on the market, meaning how much something costs and how much a person earns is based on how much what they produce can be sold for, while under socialism, the government regulates all of this and decides, instead of the market, the prices and the incomes and everything else. In turn, communism is a form of socialism where the working class is empowered, meaning factory workers and other similar jobs control everything, including the industries of the nation. In addition, the concept of class is supposed to eventually dissolve under communism as part of the system, and everyone should become an equal citizen and have no personal property and together run the government. In addition, the government too should eventually no longer be needed when full equality is reached and communism has reached its full totality. Thus, all things are divided amongst society equally, based not on what people want, but what they need. However, the Soviet Union, though adopted communism, they also put their own spin on communism and changed it. So communism under the Soviet Union was influenced very much initially by the founder of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, and this form of communism was called Leninism. And Lenin believed that communism should be achieved by any means necessary, especially by revolution, and where a dictatorship should be in charge of the nation in order to enforce communism in the nation. So he really believed that communism needed to have a structure of force to ensure that it would work and to ensure that it could, continue to exist. And Lenin came to power in the early 1900s after he helped overthrow the Russian monarchy, and this led to the creation of the Soviet Union. So Leninism, though, would not be fully developed ideology, and it had room for interpretation. And so it become even more specific ideology under the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who led the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1953. And Stalin would take the communist ideology of Leninism and add on to it to create a more developed ideology called Stalinism. And this new ideology was incredibly strict, allowing for absolutely no discussion of policies of the Soviet Union and required complete obedience. Otherwise, you were considered to betray the Soviet Union. And this is how you get Soviet Union communism. So under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union would become an industrial powerhouse. But when Stalin first came into power, he started to feel like he needed to find ways to solidify his power more and to gain even more control over society. In fact, he wanted complete control over Soviet society. And thus Stalin began what was known as Stalin's Great Purges, where he began executing and imprisoning lots of people in these gulags, also known as labor camps. And this included basically anyone he felt could possibly interfere in this process of creating the communist Soviet Union that he wanted. And this included killing many of the revolutionaries that helped form the Soviet Union in the first place. And all of these people were essentially innocent of actual crimes, but Stalin and his supporters just invented crimes, so they were just show trials. In addition, Stalin would also execute the top Soviet military leaders and many others in the Soviet military. And this execution of Soviet military leaders actually caused a lot of problems for the Soviet Union early on in World War II because they had just thrown away so much of their military talent, and it really hurt the Soviet response to Nazi Germany during the war. Now, in terms of the number of people that ended up going to these gulags, estimates vary, but somewhere around 15 million Soviets were put into these prison camps, mostly based on sort of bizarre suspicions rather than evidence of crimes plotting against Stalin's government. However, these labor camps would become an important part of the Soviet economy. Thus, in the big picture, under Stalin, tens of millions of Soviets would die, all due to his insecurities and paranoia about potential traitors being everywhere in the Soviet Union. Now, when it comes to American capitalism, the idea behind capitalism is true to the American system. However, despite many things in the system being driven by the markets, the government did and does still to this day regulate those markets to a certain extent in order to benefit the nation and its citizens. However, how much it is regulated often depends on the politicians in charge of the nation. For instance, under the American president Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal was created, which was a set of laws that increased the role of the government in the country when it came to regulating the market economy in order to protect the nation and American citizens from problems which can occur from unregulated capitalism. So now moving on to the actual origins of the Cold War, which really started to form during World War II as the Americans and Soviets started to become more and more suspicious of each other. You see, under American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Soviets and Americans had an okay working relationship with each other during the war, and Stalin and Roosevelt had a certain amount of trust for each other. But after Roosevelt died and was replaced by President Harry Truman, things began to change quite a bit. Truman did not have much trust of the Soviets, and over time, he learned information about the Soviets that wasn't available to Roosevelt, which only increased his skepticism of the Soviets and Stalin especially. For instance, he noticed the Soviets were putting in place communist governments during World War II all over Eastern Europe, and he started to learn from American embassies in these countries that these nations were becoming dictatorships under Soviet influence. As for the Soviets, Stalin consistently feared that his World War II allies, the British and Americans, couldn't be trusted either. In fact, Stalin didn't trust anyone, especially American capitalists. He thought the Americans purposely delayed entering the war to hurt the Soviets. In reality, however, the Americans didn't feel prepared to enter the war as early as Stalin wanted. The Soviets, though, didn't believe this, since while the Americans were busy preparing, the Soviets were having millions of people die fighting in the war. So you could see where this tension could take place. Before entering the war, though, it should be pointed out the Americans did give some aid to the Soviets to help them, which was useful to the Soviets. but not quite what obviously the Soviets were sacrificing on a regular basis because they were actually fighting. In addition, Stalin also feared that the Americans and the British would not agree to force unconditional surrender upon Germany, and he felt that the American use of the atomic bomb was meant to intimidate the Soviet Union rather than to force Japan to surrender. However, the British and Americans did agree to force unconditional surrender, pleasing Stalin, and the American atomic bombs, though naturally had this effect of intimidation upon the Soviets, it really wasn't its main purpose, and the main purpose was to get the Japanese to surrender based on the plan that the Americans had come up with. So the tension between Truman and Stalin was already growing during the Second World War, and after the war, it would get even more tense. And this was due to what was called Operation Keyhole. And what this operation entailed was a prisoner swap between the Soviets and the Americans, where the Soviets sent American soldiers back to America who were freed by the Soviets from German prisons, and the Americans would do the same for Soviet soldiers they freed from German prisons, or just Soviets that had fled the Soviet military for whatever reason. However, the sending back of Soviet soldiers started to become a big problem for the Americans, because as part of the process, before they would send someone back, they would conduct an interview. And the goal behind this was to confirm the identities of these soldiers to make sure that they're sending back the right people. And in the process of these interviews, they started to learn more and more about life under Stalin. And they began to learn that many of these Soviet soldiers were afraid to go back to the Soviet Union because under Stalin, the idea of being captured was considered unacceptable. And so any soldiers sent back would be considered potential spies and would be sent to the Gulag or even executed. As a result, it wasn't uncommon for Soviet soldiers to commit suicide before being returned to the Soviet Union out of fear of what would happen if they went back. In turn, it also wasn't uncommon for American soldiers involved in this exchange to find loopholes in the rules in order to not have to send people back to the Soviet Union. And just to give some perspective about how strict Stalin was about the concept of Soviet soldiers being captured. During World War II, there was an instance where one of his sons was captured by the Nazis during the war, and they offered to exchange him for a German prisoner, and Stalin just refused, feeling that he didn't care if it was his son that was captured. It didn't matter. Unacceptable. And later, this son would die during the war. In turn, the tensions with the Soviets only increased when more information was revealed about the horrors of Stalin's government. Also, the Soviets never sent back all American prisoners either. So therefore, the fact that both sides were not sending back all the prisoners increased tensions more. And just one more side note about Stalin's rule over the Soviet Union was that when he was in power, people had no idea that this was going on. And those who were sent to the gulags had no idea that Stalin was orchestrating all this. You had cases where some people thought I only wish Stalin knew about what was happening here. And so it's a very strange situation where there was just so much misinformation and people just didn't get what was fully going on. The Americans didn't fully realize it, and you had Soviets that didn't fully realize it. But there are also people that did start to get it or knew about it that started telling Americans and the British. And so it's just a very complex and crazy situation. So after World War II, the alliance between the US and Soviet Union would weaken even more as the Soviet Union started to gain influence and creating more communist governments in Eastern Europe, and they wanted to prevent Germany from ever becoming a threat again. In the meantime, the US began gaining influence in Western Europe by giving financial aid to various countries under the idea called the Marshall Plan, and this plan was created to aid 17 different countries that had been badly affected by World War II in Western and Southern Europe, so that their democratic institutions could survive, because early on after World War II, poverty and unemployment were high, which put these nations at risk for chaos and could potentially allow for a communist government to assume control. So after World War II, this ideological war known as the Cold War really started to get intense after an event called the Berlin Blockade occurred. And what happened was in 1948, France, Britain, and America decided to unite their occupied zones in Germany to create a unified German economy. This upset the Soviet Union, though, who refused this idea, fearing the recreation of a strong Germany, and in response blocked all travel from East Berlin and Eastern Germany to the capital, West Berlin, and Western Germany. And essentially, this isolated the Eastern German economy, and the Soviets would create a different currency there than the West. And this posed a really big threat to Western Germany economically, and in fact required Americans and British to airlift food into Western Germany to prevent starvation for the people there. Later, the Soviets would end the blockade since the airlifts from the British and Americans made it ineffective. However, East and West Germany remained separate and had two different economies. In turn, after this incident, the United States of America felt the Soviet Union were becoming more and more dangerous, and the Americans would create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, in 1945, to resist the Soviet presence in Europe. And this organization included initially Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Britain, and of course the US. These were the original members, but later during the Cold War, Greece, Turkey, West Germany, and Spain would join as well. And that same year, the Soviets would create their first nuclear weapons thanks to Soviet spies in America, which were able to get the secrets behind these nuclear weapons and bring them back to the Soviet Union. And this was a game changer. This really caused tensions to just explode, because now the Americans were not the only country in the world with nuclear weapons. And in addition, the Soviet Union, also at around this time, began to expand its communist influence, and China would become communist that same year. So you have two huge events. You have the population of China, which is gigantic, becoming communist, and the Soviets also have nuclear weapons now. So for Americans, this was a nightmare. However, in 1953, there was hope that the tension could decrease since Stalin died, and a new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, came to power over the Soviet Union. And Nikita Khrushchev really thought of himself as a reformer. He would weaken the Gulag labor camp system and was more interested in bringing greater equality in the Soviet Union. Also, in America, President Dwight D. Eisenhower would replace Harry Truman, and this change of leadership represented an opportunity for the Soviets and Americans to improve their relationship. Unfortunately, though, the Americans and Soviets still just couldn't understand each other. And the Americans underestimated how much the Soviet Union had changed under Khrushchev, and as a result, fear still prevented diplomatic progress. This was especially true because the Americans, seeing what happened with nuclear weapons and China, would fall into what was called the Red Scare, where Americans became so paranoid about Soviet spies in America that America began investigating anyone who had contacts with the Communist Party in America, thinking that they could be a Soviet spy. And the American public and government officials just became completely obsessed with trying to find these communists everywhere. And from here, this division of capitalists and communists would continue with the end of the Korean War, where the Soviets supporting North Korea and the Americans supporting South Korea led to the breaking up of Korea, dividing into North and South, with the war ending in 1953. In addition, the same year, the Soviets used military force to preserve East Germany's communist government. A year later, in 1954, the Americans would overthrow the democratically elected Guatemalan government, which leaned socialist, fearing it would become communist, and instead they put a pro-American dictator in charge of this country. Then later, in 1955, to match the Americans' creation of NATO, the Soviet Union would create its own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact, which include the following modern-day nations: the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. However, later in the Cold War, Albania and East Germany would leave the alliance, and a year later, in 1956, the Soviets would continue their preservation of communist governments in Eastern Europe by invading Hungary, defeating a revolution against the communist government there. And from here, this ideological war became even closer to a traditional war in the late 1950s, since the Americans and the Soviets were both creating intercontinental ballistic missiles, where these nuclear weapons could be launched from the ground and hit targets across the world on different continents. And by the time we get to the 1960s, the world was almost at nuclear war. You see, in 1961, the Americans would try to overthrow another government, this one being the Communist government of Cuba, but they failed to do so. So in 1962, nuclear war would become even closer to really happening with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here, the Cuban Communist dictatorship was promised military protection by the Soviet Union, and as a result, the Soviet Union began preparing to put ballistic missiles that could launch nuclear weapons in Cuba. And the idea behind this was to be able to launch attacks against the United States of America if they felt it was necessary. And this plan obviously greatly upset the Americans, who did decide to do a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent the Soviets from putting nuclear missiles there. And after an enormous amount of fear filling the world, thinking that there really would be a nuclear war, the Soviets and Americans, though, took the rational route and began to ease the tensions after an agreement where the Soviets decided to return all nuclear missile equipment back to the Soviet Union, and the Americans said that they would never invade Cuba and they would remove their nuclear missiles in Turkey, which could reach the Soviet Union. So both the Soviet Union and the Americans understood that nuclear war was the equivalent of committing suicide, and thus both used reason to determine provoking each other too much was a stupid thing to do, and in 1963 signed a treaty banning the test of nuclear weapons to show that they were not interested in a nuclear war. Then, a year later, in 1964, this continuous battle for either capitalist or communist influence the world would continue, when the Americans would get seriously involved in the infamous Vietnam War, where they were hoping to prevent communist-controlled northern Vietnam from gaining control of southern Vietnam. Because so many nations around the world were becoming communist, the Americans just felt that they had to stop this. However, the Americans would fail to win freedom for southern Vietnam after lots of political pressure back home to give up on the war, which was not going well for Americans. And since the North Vietnamese were just waiting for the Americans to get tired of the war, it was really not a war that was a good investment for the Americans. And back in America, there was also a huge amount of criticism because there was so much hypocrisy of American policy in Vietnam, where they were willing to send these American kids to Vietnam to create democracy in southern Vietnam, but they were at the same time denying democratic freedoms to African Americans back home, given this was during the Civil Rights Movement in America. Also around this time, in 1965, the Americans would overthrow another democratically elected government in the Dominican Republic, which leaned socialist, fearing it too would become communist. And then the Soviets would invade Czechoslovakia, modern-day Czech Republic, and Slovakia in 1968 to preserve a communist government there, as they did in other pro-communist nations earlier, and later they would do the same in Afghanistan. And in the 1970s, tensions between the Soviets and Americans would decline more again, thanks to what was known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which would place limits on the number of nuclear missiles each nation could have. And this limitation would be set in 1972, and further limitations would be put in place in 1979. So turning towards the 1980s, Cold War tensions still existed as the Soviets and Americans were still active in building their militaries and trying to spread their influence around the world. For instance, in 1983, in Grenada, the Americans overthrew another socialist government, which had overthrown the earlier government, and thus after the American invasion of the old government was restored. But this competition of influence in the 1980s was starting to change, as the Soviet Union began to have more and more problems back home. Economic declines, which were starting in the 1980s, were causing lots and lots of issues. Life in the Soviet Union was pretty rough. Most people were poor, but they were taken care of by the government. However, the country often faced a shortage of consumer goods, and as a result, many were saving money and hoarding goods as much as possible due to poverty. In addition, because there were so many people struggling, and due to all this poverty, it resulted in many people taking part in the illegal black market economy to make extra money, which made up more than 10% of the Soviet economy. In addition, the government made several mistakes when managing their economy, and they were especially hurt when oil prices dropped, which was devastating for the Soviets since their economy was very one-dimensional and heavily dependent on selling oil as a nation. And the Soviets were just not very good at innovation in general when it came to creating new profitable industries like America was with its market-based economy. As a result, the Soviet Union was often adopting technologies created abroad instead of creating their own, and thus their economic profits kept dropping and was unable to recover, failing to find ways to make their economy more dynamic. And by 1990, when a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came into power, he envisioned changing the Soviet Union dramatically. And in 1991, he was struggling to find ways to stop the decline economically, and he tried to create a more open economy with some free market principles, allowing some freedom to businesses, and moving away from government-controlled industries. But that couldn't quite fix the problem, and even made things worse, because though there was greater economic freedom, government officials still had lots of influence, and began favoring policies that only benefited themselves. And in addition to the government officials' corruption, there was also a big problem financially where too much money was being used to fund the military instead of helping potential businesses that could help the country transition more away from a completely closed economy to a market economy. Also, Gorbachev was wanting to make the Soviet Union more democratic, and he allowed for more freedom of press and a greater amount of information to be let out to citizens. But this turned out to be too much too soon for the public to handle and overwhelmed the already struggling Soviet Union, since the expectations of the Soviet people would grow much faster than what was possible. And once people started to realize all the problems going on in the Soviet Union that were typically hidden historically, and lots of criticism started to spread throughout society by people, and negativity started flowing through society, killing national pride in the Soviet Union as people start to see a nation that was falling apart and all the mistakes the nation was making and had made in the past, which was hidden before, especially all the corruption. And in 1991, the buildup of all these problems in the Soviet Union would force the Soviet Union to come to an end. There was a failed coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev by the conservative government officials who rejected his reforms and wanted to preserve authoritarian rule. But the coup would end up failing because ultimately the Soviet military was not in full support of it, and it was not willing to kill Soviet citizens to make it successful. However, just the fact that this coup had attempted in the first place, it highlighted just how damaged the Soviet Union had become, and it would collapse as Soviet state leaders, these being leaders of the individual nations that had made up the Federation, which was the Soviet Union, had collectively decided that the Soviet states should become separate. And this resulted in much of the world giving up socialism in favor of capitalism. Thus, the United States of America, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had achieved power beyond anyone in all of human history as a nation. And for the moment, with the fall of the Soviet Union, had no competition in the world. Thus, the Cold War marked the most potentially dangerous time in human history, with the new possibility of nuclear war. But at the same time, this competition also fueled more human innovation, with the Soviets putting the first human being in space and the Americans putting the first human being on the moon. Thus, as always, despite the conflicts that seem to continuously occur in human society, innovation continues to make progress and people continue to change the world more and more, usually resulting in a better world, despite the tragedies that always seem to occur in the process. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to Phase 18. Please feel free to share with your friends, follow Roots of Reality on social media, or visit rootsofreality.com for more information. And as always, remember, billions of years led to you, so make the most of it.